Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Here is the second exciting volume of the Hardy Boys mysteries. In the house on the cliff, Frank and Joe Hardy stumble on a mystery as they and their friends Biff, Chet, and Jerry are riding their motorcycles around Barmet Bay one Saturday in early June. When they decide to explore an old deserted house, none of the boys is frightened or concerned, until a blood-curdling scream emanates from the empty dwelling. Could the house be haunted, or is someone trying to scare them away from the area for some nefarious purpose? Here is the first episode in this second Hardy Boys adventure. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in the House on the Cliff. Chapter 1. The Haunted House. 3 powerful motorcycles sped along the shore road that leads from the city of Bayport, skirting Barmet Bay, on the Atlantic coast. It was a bright Saturday morning in June, and although the city sweltered in the heat, cool breezes blew in from the bay. 2 of the motorcycles carried an extra passenger. All the cyclists were boys of about 15 and 16 years of age, and all 5 were students at the Bayport High School. They were enjoying their Saturday holiday by this outing, glad of the chance to get away from the torrid warmth of the city for a few hours. When the foremost motorcycle reached a place where the shore road formed a junction with another highway leading to the north, the rider brought his machine to a stop and waited for the others to draw alongside. He was a tall, dark youth of 16 with a clever, good-natured face. His name was Frank Hardy. "Where do we go from here?" he called out to the others. The 2 remaining motorcycles came to a stop, and the drivers mopped their brows, while the 2 other boys dismounted, glad of the chance to stretch their legs. One of the cyclists, a boy of 15, fair, with light curly hair, was Joe Hardy, a brother of Frank's, and the other lad was Chet Morton, a chum of the Hardy Boys. The other youths were Jerry Gilroy and Biff Hooper, typical healthy American lads of high school age. "You're the leader," Joe said to his brother. "We'll follow you." "I'd rather have it settled. We've started out without any particular place to go. There's not much fun just riding around the countryside." "I don't care much where we go as long as we keep on going," said Jerry. "We get a breeze as long as we're traveling, but the minute we stop I begin to sweat." Chet Morton gazed along the shore road. "I'll tell you what we can do," he said suddenly. "Let's go and visit the haunted house." "Palooka's place? Sure, we've never been out there." "I've passed it," Frank said, "but I didn't go very close to the place, I'll tell you." Jerry Gilroy, who was a newcomer to Bayport, looked puzzled. "Where is Palooka's place?" "You can see it from here. Look," said Chet, taking him by the arm and bringing him over to the side of the road. "See where the shore road dips, away out near the end of Barmet Bay? Do you see that cliff?" "Yes, there's a stone house at the top." "Well, that's Palooka's place." "Who is Palooka?" "Who was Palooka, you mean?" interjected Frank. "He used to live there, but he was murdered." "And that's why the place is supposed to be haunted?" "Reason enough, isn't it?" said Biff Hooper. "I don't believe in ghosts, but I'll tell the world that there are some funny stories going around about that house ever since Palooka was killed." "He must have been a strange fellow anyway," commented Jerry, "to build a house in such a place as that." Indeed, the Palooka place had been built on an unusual site. High above the waters of the bay it stood, Built close to the edge of a rocky and inhospitable cliff, it was some distance back from the road, and there was no other house within miles. The boys had traveled a little more than 3 miles since leaving Bayport, and the Palooka place was at least 5 miles away. It could hardly have been seen had it not been for its prominent position on top of the cliff, silhouetted clearly against the sky. "He was a strange fellow," Frank observed. "No one knew very much about him. He didn't welcome visitors. In fact, he always kept a couple of vicious dogs around the place, so nobody cared to hang around there if they weren't invited." "He was a miser," came from Joe Hardy. "He may have been. At least that was the theory. Everybody said Palooka had a lot of money, but after his death, there wasn't a nickel found in the house." "Felix Palooka always said he wouldn't trust the banks," put in Biff Hooper. "But if he had any money, I don't know where he made it, for he didn't work at anything, and he mighty seldom came into the city." "Perhaps he inherited it," Jerry suggested. "Maybe. He must have had money at some time to build that house. It's a great rambling stone place that must have cost thousands." "Is anybody living there now?" The others shook their heads. "No one has lived there since the murder, and I don't think anyone ever will," said Frank Hardy. "The house is too far out of the way, for one thing, and then, well, the stories that have been going around." "Well, I won't say I believe any place is haunted, but the Palooka place is certainly strange. There have been queer lights seen there at night, on stormy nights particularly, and once a motorist had a breakdown near there, so he went up to the house for help. He didn't know anything about the history of the place. He got the scare of his life." "What happened?" "He decided when he went into the front yard that the place was deserted, and he was just going to turn away when he saw an old man standing at one of the upper windows, looking at him. He called out, and the old man went away, and although the motorist hunted all through the house, he didn't find any trace of the old chap, so he left that place as quickly as he could." "I don't blame him," remarked Jerry, "but the house sounds interesting. I'm game to visit it." "So am I," declared the others. "Lead on," laughed Chet. "It'll be a brave ghost that'll tackle the whole 5 of us." Jerry clambered on behind Chet, and Biff mounted Joe's motorcycle. The machines roared, and the little cavalcade started on its way down the shore road toward the house on the cliff. Instead of being an aimless trip, the outing now had assumed all the aspects of an adventure. With the exception of Jerry, the boys had all passed by the Palooka place at one time or another, but none had ever ventured off the main road to explore the deserted place. The lane leading into the Palooka grounds, never kept in good repair even during the owner's lifetime, was now almost indiscernible and was overgrown with weeds and bushes. The house itself was hidden from the roadway by trees. Most people gave the place a wide berth, whether they believed in ghosts or not, for the stories that had been told of the rambling stone building since the murder of Felix Palooka 2 years before were sufficient to indicate that there had been strange happenings in the old house. Whether or not they were of supernatural origin was a matter of debate. The murder of Felix Palooka had been particularly brutal. He was an old Italian, suspected, as Frank had said, of being a miser. He was very eccentric in his ways, and most people considered that he was not quite sound mentally. Be that as it may, Bayport was shocked one morning to learn that the old man had been found dead in the kitchen of his house, his body riddled with bullets. The motive apparently was robbery, for although it was popularly believed that the old man possessed a great deal of money that he kept with him in the house, it was never found, in spite of the most diligent search. This was the gloomy history of the place the Hardy Boys and their chums were now about to visit and explore. To add to the atmosphere of excitement, that had possessed them from the moment the old house was mentioned. As they drew closer to the cliff, the sun retired behind a cloud, and the sky gradually became darker. Frank glanced up. Although the sky had been bright and clear when the party left Bayport, clouds had gathered in the east, and it was plain that a storm was gathering. "Looks as if we'll have to go into the Palooka place whether we want to or not," he called out to the others. "It's going to rain." In a little while they came to the lane that led to the haunted house. In spite of the fact that it was overgrown with weeds and bushes, the boys were able to drive down the faintly defined roadway until at last a rusty iron gate barred their progress. Frank, who was in the lead, got off his machine and kicked the gate open, the rusty chains clanking dismally as they fell from the staples. Then the party went on into the grounds. Under the lowering sky that heralded the approaching storm, the grounds of the Palooka place were far from inviting. Dank, tall grass grew beneath the unkempt trees, and thistles and weeds sprouted up in the very center of the roadway. A rising wind stirred among the branches of the trees, and the waving grasses rustled mournfully. "Creepy sort of a place," muttered Jerry. "Wait till you see the house," Chet advised. Not one of them could restrain a slight shiver of apprehension when at last they came in view of the old stone building. It was framed in a mass of trees, bushes, and weeds that threatened to engulf it from all sides. Weeds obscured the front door. Bushes grew up level with the sills of the vacant downstairs windows. Trees on either side, and beyond the house, extended trailing branches down over the roof. A shutter hung by one hinge from an upstairs window and banged with every passing gust of wind. A death-like silence hung over the whole building. Under the black clouds that now filled the entire sky, it was imbued with an atmosphere of gloom and terror. "Come on," said Frank. "Now that we're here, we may as well go through the place." "Haven't seen any ghosts yet," laughed Chet, with an effort at being light-hearted. But in spite of himself, his tone seemed forced. They left the motorcycles beneath a tree and advanced toward the old stone building. The front door was almost off its hinges, and it swung creakingly open at Frank's touch. Frank stepped boldly into the hallway. The interior of the house was veiled in gloom, for the rear windows were boarded up, but the lads could see that everything was deep in dust. A staircase was before them, leading to the upper stories of the building. To the left was a closed door. "This must be the parlor," said Frank, as he flung open the door. The room was empty. A stone fireplace was at one side, and as the boys came through the room, a rat scuttled out of the fireplace and raced across the floor, disappearing through a hole in the wall. The sound made everyone jump, for the boys' nerves were at a tension on account of the forbidding atmosphere. "Just a rat," said Frank. His voice had the effect of calming the others. They stood hesitantly in the middle of the deserted parlor. Joe went over to the window and looked out. But the view from the front window of the Palooka place was so lonely and gruesome in its aspect of tangled trees and weeds and undergrowth, under the lowering darkness of the sky, that he came back. "Where shall we go next?" said Chet. "Nothing much to see around here," said Frank, disappointed. "It's just an ordinary, dirty old deserted house. Let's explore upstairs anyway." At that moment, there was a startling interruption. A weird shriek, quavering as if with terror, rang out from the upper part of the haunted house. Chapter 2. The Storm. That shriek was the most fearful and uncanny sound the boys had ever heard. There was a diabolical malignance about it, like the scream of some bloodthirsty animal. Yet there was no mistaking the fact that it was uttered by a human being. As the quavering notes died away, the bare walls of the old house flung back the echoes, so that the shriek seemed to be repeated again and again, but on a smaller scale. The boys stared at one another aghast. For a moment they were dumbfounded. Then Jerry muttered, "I'm getting out of here," and with that he started for the door. "Me too," declared Biff Hooper, and Chet Morton followed him as he rushed for the doorway. "What's the big idea?" asked Frank, standing his ground. "Let's stay and find out what this is all about." Joe, seeing his brother remain where he was, made no move to follow the others, although it was plain that the weird shriek had unnerved him. "You can stay," flung back Jerry. "I'm not. This place is haunted, and I don't mean maybe." The three boys hastened through the doorway out into the hall, and lost no time in regaining the front yard. Frank and Joe Hardy listened to their retreating footsteps. Frank shrugged his shoulders. "I guess it gave him a pretty bad scare," he said to his brother. "We may as well go with them." "I guess so," replied Joe, greatly relieved. They were alone in the gloomy and deserted old house, and as they stepped into the hallway, Joe cast a cautious glance up the stairway. But there was nothing to be seen. The upper floor was veiled in shadow. The house was in silence that seemed even heavier than before. When the two Hardy boys got outside, they found the others waiting for them in the shelter of some trees about 100 yards from the house. The three were discussing the strange occurrence in excited tones, and when the Hardy boys came up to them, Jerry said, "I don't have to be convinced any further. The place is haunted, sure. No other way to explain it." "There's not much sense in running away from a sound," remarked Frank lightly. "If we'd have seen something, it might be different. I don't believe in ghosts, and I'd like to get to the bottom of this. It's foolish to run away. Let's go back." Chet Morton and Biff Hooper looked a trifle ashamed of themselves because of their precipitous flight from the house while the Hardy boys had remained. "I got the scare of my life," Chet confessed. "Just the same, I'm game to go back if you want to. How about you, Biff?" Biff Hooper scratched his head reflectively. "I'm none too anxious to go back in there again," he admitted. "Not that I'm scared, of course," he added hastily, "but I don't see where we'd learn anything anyway." "Well, Joe and I are going back. That's settled," declared Frank. "We want to get to the bottom of this mystery." "Ha! Mysteries are your meat," observed Biff. "Well, when you come to think of it, this is a good chance for a little detective work." He alluded to the fact that the Hardy boys were amateur detectives of some renown in Bayport. They came by their gift naturally, for their father, Fenton Hardy, had been for years on the detective staff of the New York police. Of late years he had been living in Bayport, conducting a private detective service of his own, with great success. He was known from one end of the country to the other as an exceptionally brilliant investigator. Frank and Joe Hardy, his sons, were ambitious to follow in their father's footsteps, although their mother wished them to prepare themselves for medicine and the law respectively. But the lure of Fenton Hardy's calling was persistent, and the two boys were bent on proving to their parents that they were capable of becoming first-class detectives. They had given proof of this already by helping their father in a small way on a number of cases. But their first big success had been achieved when they solved the mystery of a jewel and bond robbery from Tower Mansion in Bayport. The story of this had been related in the first and preceding volume of this series, The Hardy Boys in the Tower Treasure, wherein was recounted how the Hardy Boys solved the mystery of the robbery when the Bayport police and even Fenton Hardy himself were baffled. "Ha! I'd rather tackle a good mystery than eat," laughed Frank, "and here's one right to hand. Let's go back." Biff Hooper did not care to seem guilty of cowardice by staying behind while his companions returned to the house, and he was on the point of a reluctant consent when the matter was suddenly solved for them all by a downpour of rain. Storm clouds had been gathering in the sky for the past hour, and there had been dull rumblings of thunder. Now an uneasy wind stirred the branches of the trees and rustled dismally among the undergrowth. There was a spatter of raindrops, and then the storm broke in abrupt violence. Rain poured down in sheets. "The motorcycles!" cried Frank. Turning up their coat collars, the boys ran through the thick grass until they reached the place where their machines had been parked. "I saw an old shed near the house," called out Joe. "We can put the bikes under cover." There was an abandoned wagon shed near the rear of the house, and toward this refuge the lads trundled the heavy motorcycles. Although the shed was almost falling to pieces, the roof was still in fairly good condition, and the machines were safe from the downpour. "Come on," said Frank, when the motorcycles had been placed under cover. "Let's go back into the house." He led the way, running across the open space from the shed, through the driving rain, and Joe followed. The others, after a moment of hesitation, came after them. The back door of the house was open, and the lads ran up the steps into the shelter of the building. They were in a room that had been evidently used as a kitchen, and although rain came in slanting streaks through the open windows, the glass of which had long since been shattered, they were at least sheltered from the downpour that had assumed redoubled violence. The rain drummed on the roof of the old house and poured from black skies on the nearby wagon shed. Thunder rolled and rumbled threateningly, and every once in a while a sheet of lightning tore a band of lurid light across the gloom. Chet took off his cap, which was drenched, and tried to dry it out. The others stood by the window, looking out at the terrific downpour. Then came the second shriek. It rang out at a time when none of the lads was talking, and it was a replica of the first, a quavering, long drawn-out yell that seemed to freeze the blood in their veins. No sooner had it died away than there came a terrific clap of thunder, and then the rain seemed to beat down on the roof of the house in a frenzy. In the gloomy, dusty kitchen, the boys stared at one another. Frank broke the silence. "I'm going to find out about this," he declared firmly, striding over to the door that led to the interior of the house. "Me too," said Joe. Taking heart by the Hardy boys' example, the others crowded at their heels. Frank flung open the door and strode into the room beyond. It was a very gloomy chamber, for the one window was boarded up, but when their eyes became accustomed to the meager light, the boys saw that a door on the far side of the room led into a hallway. It was evidently not the hallway that they had already been in at the front of the house, but presumably one that led to a side door. "Nothing here," said Frank. "I'd like to find those stairs." That yell came from the upper part of the house. The boys made their way across the room. Outside, they could hear the sweep of the rain and the steady rumblings of the thunder, for the storm was now at its height. Through the chinks of the boards over the window, they could occasionally see the lurid glare of lightning. Suddenly there was a blast of wind that seemed to shake the entire house. A sharp, violent noise immediately behind them made every boy jump with surprise. They wheeled about. The door behind them had been blown shut. Biff Hooper, who was nearest, grasped the knob and tried to open it. He wrenched and tugged at the door, but it remained obstinate. "We're locked in," he muttered. "We can get out all right," said Frank. "There must be a door in this side hall." He walked across the room and entered the hallway. At the same instant, a maniacal howl rang through the old house. The hollow echoes magnified its volume. A flash of lightning illuminated the startled faces of the 5 boys. With one accord, they rushed into the hallway. It was a narrow place, heavy with dust, and their feet thudded heavily on the moldy flooring. Crash! At the far end of the hall, they had a glimpse of falling plaster that fell in a great heap to the floor. A dense cloud of dust arose and filled the narrow chamber. "Run for your lives!" yelled Frank. But no sooner were the words out of his mouth than there came a ripping, crackling sound from overhead. Immediately above them, a large part of the ceiling, disturbed no doubt by the vibrations of their feet as they ran into the hall, had given way. A wide crack that showed in the plaster quickly became wider, and then, with a terrific roar, half the ceiling came tumbling down upon the lads. They were buried in dust and lath and plaster that came upon them in such an avalanche that they were thrown to the floor. The splintering of wood and ominous crackling that followed indicated that more of the ceiling was about to go, and then came a roar even louder than the first, as another avalanche of debris rolled down upon them. Was the Palooka house falling in? Chapter 3. Empty Toolboxes. When he was knocked off his feet by the impact of falling debris, Frank Hardy crouched down, protecting his head as well as possible until the downfall was over. Although a great deal of rubbish descended, it was not heavy material, and when at last the rain of plaster and splintered lath had ceased, Frank knew that he was uninjured, although he was almost buried in the heap and half smothered by the thick dust that rose all about him. He managed to get to his feet, fighting his way clear of the rubbish, and the first sight that met his eyes was an arm sticking out of the debris nearby. He seized the outstretched hand and dragged the owner to safety, discovering that it was his brother Joe. By this time, the others were beginning to extricate themselves, and within a few minutes, all 5 boys, covered with dust from head to foot, had scrambled out to the clear floor in the middle of the hall. No one was injured, although Joe and Jerry complained of bruises about the head and shoulders. "Let's get out of here," exclaimed Chet as soon as he could get his breath. "I'm not going to fool around this house any longer." He looked about him for some means of escape. "I don't think it's very healthy myself," Frank agreed. He saw a door at the side of the hall, and going over to it, tried to open it. But the door was locked fast, and although he kicked at it and shoved against the panels with all his strength, he was unable to budge it. "There's a window," declared Joe. "Let's break our way out." The window was boarded over, but the glass was already shattered. So Chet and Jerry, picking up rocks that had tumbled down in the debris from the walls and ceiling, pounded at the boards. "We'd better keep moving," advised Biff Hooper. "Perhaps the rest of the place will start caving in on us." There was a splintering sound as one of the boards fell loose, revealing the rain-soaked trees and bushes outside. Another onslaught with the rocks, and another board fell away, leaving a space sufficient to admit the passage of a human body. "Gee, that looks good to me. Let's get out of here quick." "That suits me." "Don't lose any time. This whole building may be coming down." As the last words were uttered, the boys heard another crash behind them. It was so close that it made them all jump. "Hurry up, everybody," yelled Biff Hooper. "Can't get out of here too fast for me," returned Jerry. "You said it," muttered Chet. One by one, the boys scrambled up on the windowsill and squeezed their way out between the boards, until at last all were standing outside the old house. The storm was still raging. Rain poured down in a drenching torrent. "Now, let's get as far away from this place as we can travel," said Jerry. "Somebody's going to get killed if we stick around here much longer." He was pale with fright, and it was plain that the strange experiences of the past hour had completely unnerved him. "That's the way I feel about it," agreed Biff Hooper. "I'm not a bit comfortable around here. Let's beat it." "I'd like to find out what's wrong with the place," persisted Frank doggedly. "You couldn't drag me back in there with a team of horses," objected Chet. "Let's clear out. I've had enough of it." "Come on," urged Jerry. "There's no use going back." The whole place'll cave in on us if we're not careful. And anyhow, there's something fishy about the house." Frank saw that the others were determined on leaving, in spite of the pouring rain. So reluctantly he gave in, and the 5 boys hastened around the side of the house over to the shed where they had left the motorcycles. "We can at least stay in the shed till the rain goes over," he said. "Not on your life," declared Chet Morton. "I'm going to put as much distance between little me and that haunted house as I can. That place gets on my nerves." And with that he began tinkering with the machine, preparatory to starting it. Frank and Joe decided that no good would be served by arguing the matter, so they prepared to leave with the others, although they privately resolved to return to the Palooka place at the earliest opportunity to investigate the mystery of the house on the cliff more thoroughly. Jerry and Biff took their places, and in a few minutes the 3 motorcycles drove slowly out of the shed and across the yard toward the lane. It was then that they heard the laugh. From the haunted house came a harsh, mocking laugh that rang out in peals of derisive merriment. It continued for several seconds, and could be heard quite plainly, even above the noise of the engines and the drumming of the rain on the roof. Then it stopped abruptly. The boys looked at one another. "Did you hear someone laugh?" asked Frank, unable to believe his ears. "You bet I did!" exclaimed Chet. "And that does settle it. I'm leaving here right away." "That was the most nerve-wracking laugh I ever heard in my life," declared Jerry. "Let's get out of here quick." "Somebody's playing a joke on us," Frank said angrily. "I'm going back." "Joke nothing! That place is haunted! Come on!" And with a roar, Chet's motorcycle leaped forward as he headed down the lane toward the main road. Joe, after looking behind and motioning to his brother to stay with the party, followed him. Soon the 3 motorcycles were speeding down the lane, and from the haunted house came peal after peal of that same demoniacal laughter, as though mocking their flight. Then, as they rode on through the streaming rain, and the haunted house was lost to sight among the wet and sodden trees, the laughter died away. When they reached the main road, the boys turned their motorcycles in the direction of Bayport, and for more than 5 minutes the machines rocked and swerved as they sped along through the muddy ruts. The boys were soaked to the skin, and water dripped from the peaks of their caps into their eyes. The rain poured down with redoubled violence, and the others could scarcely see Chet's machine through the misty downpour. Chet was making such good time back to Bayport that they found it difficult to keep up with him. Frank Hardy was still dissatisfied. He had really wanted to remain behind and probe the mystery of the house on the cliff further. He held no stock in the ghost theory. The shrieks and the mocking laugh, he was sure, were of human origin. But what could have been the motive? It may have been that some boys had been in the house when they arrived, and had simply seized the opportunity to play a joke on them. "In that case," he muttered to himself, "the story'll be all over Bayport High School by Monday, and we'll be kidded within an inch of our lives for running away. We should have stayed behind." Something told him, however, that this was no ordinary schoolboy prank. The incident of the fallen ceiling had unnerved him slightly. It was only by good luck that none of them had been seriously hurt. Of course, it may have been entirely accidental, but it seemed to have happened at a strangely opportune time. Then the recollections of the shrieks and the mocking laugh came back to him again, and he shivered as he recalled the maniacal intensity of the tones. If it was any fellow like ourselves, he was a mighty good actor, Frank said to himself. I've heard of a person's blood running cold, but I never knew what it meant until I heard those yells. Suddenly his motorcycle began, as he termed it, acting up. It coughed, lurched, backfired explosively, and then the engine died. "What a fine time for a breakdown," Frank said as he dismounted. Joe drew up alongside. "What's the matter?" he called. "Engine broke down." "Gosh, aren't you lucky?" exclaimed Joe, grinning. "There's a shed over at the side of the road. Bring it over under cover." He pointed to a tumble-down shed nearby. Frank realized that it might take some time to discover the trouble, so he trundled the motorcycle over to the refuge his brother had indicated. In the meantime, Chet Morton had looked back to find that the others were not following him, and had decided to return. The roar of his machine could be heard through the rain as he rode back toward them. In the shelter of the shed, Frank first of all took off his coat and cap, which were dripping wet, and hung them on a projecting board. Then, as Joe and Jerry stood by, glad of the chance to get in out of the rain, he rolled up his sleeves and prepared to find the source of the trouble. They could hear Chet calling for them as he drove along the road in the rain. "He thinks we're lost," laughed Joe. He went over to the front door of the shed and hailed their companion. "Come on up here," he shouted. "Had a breakdown." Grumbling audibly, Chet dismounted and came over toward the shed. In the meantime, Frank had opened the toolbox of his motorcycle. The others were startled by a sudden exclamation. Frank was staring at the toolbox with a bewildered expression on his face. "My tools!" he exclaimed. "They're gone!" The other boys crowded around. The toolbox was empty. "Did you have 'em when you left Bayport?" asked Joe. "Of course I did. I never go anywhere without them. Who on earth could have taken them?" "You can have mine," offered Joe, going over to his own motorcycle. He snapped open the toolbox on his machine, and then gave a shout of astonishment. "Ha! Mine are gone too!" Chapter 4. The Chase in the Bay. The boys stared at one another in bewilderment. "I know my toolbox was full when I left home," said Frank. "And so was mine," came from Joe. "I was using the pliers just before we started out." "Where could they have gone?" "They must have been stolen when the motorcycles were in the shed at the Palooka place," Chet suggested. "It's the only time they could have been taken," declared Frank. "It was the only time they were left unguarded." Joe was frankly puzzled. "But we didn't see anyone around the place," said Jerry. "No, but there was someone there. We heard those shrieks and the laugh. Someone stole those tools while we were in the house." "It's some kind of practical joke, that's what I'm beginning to think," declared Frank. "Let's go back and get those tools." "Not on your life," objected Jerry decisively. "This is a little too much. First of all, we hear those shrieks, and then the house almost comes down around our ears, and now we find that the tools have been stolen by somebody we didn't see. We're safer away from there." Biff Hooper nodded agreement. "That's what I think. There's something queer about that house. We'll get into trouble if we go butting in there any more." "But we want our tools." "Good night," Chet exclaimed. "Perhaps mine are gone too." He ran out of the shed over to the road and hastily examined the toolbox on his machine. Then he straightened up with an audible sigh of relief. "Thank goodness they're here. Guess whoever took the others figured he had enough." "I'm going back," declared Frank. "If you'll do, you'll have to excuse me," Chet said. "You're welcome to use my tools to fix up your machine, but I won't go back with you." "Me neither," chimed in Jerry and Biff simultaneously. Frank and Joe were silent. They wanted to go back to the Palooka place and investigate the matter further, but they did not want to break up the party, so they decided it would be better policy to remain with their companions. "All right," Frank said. "Lend me a pair of pliers, and I'll have this trouble fixed up in no time." He went over to Chet's motorcycle and got the desired tools. Then he began to tinker with his machine. It was only a minor defect, and a few minutes' work sufficed to repair the damage. In the meantime, it was apparent that the rain was letting up, and by the time the Hardy Boys took their motorcycles out of the shed and regained the road, it had died away to a mere drizzle. "This has been some holiday," Chet muttered as he mounted his machine again. "I'm going home. Jerry, You and Biff had better come up to our place for dinner. How about you, Joe and Frank?" "Thanks just the same, but we couldn't. We promised to be back home this afternoon. There's a side road that turns off here that makes a nice shortcut to our farm. Guess I'll go that way. There should be room for 3 on this bike, with a little crowding." Jerry and Biff clambered on the motorcycle with Chet Morton and started off. The Hardy Boys followed on their own machines until they reached the side road, about 100 yards away. There the others left them after shouting goodbye. Frank and Joe watched Chet's motorcycle, heavily laden, disappear into the mists that hovered over the road, and then they prepared to continue their journey back to Bayport. The shore road dipped at that point and wound down along the edge of the bay in a deep spiral, which brought them at one point almost back to the cliff at the top of which the Palooka place was located, although by now they were nearer the water's edge. From there the road sloped directly down to the shore, then ran along the edge of the bay and in toward the city. Frank looked up toward the top of the cliff that loomed high above them. They could not see the Palooka place from where they were, as it was on the high ground and almost masked by trees. But the mystery of the place still preyed upon their minds. "I'd like to go back there yet," said Frank suddenly. "That affair of the tools has me guessing." "Me too, but I think we'd better go on home. We can come back some other time and look for them. One minute I think it was only a practical joke of some kind, and the next minute I think it's something a whole lot deeper than that. There's something strange going on up there." There were sure a lot of strange things going on when we struck the place. That's certain. I can hear those shrieks yet. "Well, I guess you're right, Joe. We may as well go on home. But I'd like to get to the bottom of this. Whoever stole those tools made quick work of it. We weren't in the house very long. Proves that it wasn't a ghost, anyway. I never did believe in the ghost theory. No, some human took those tools, and he was watching us too. He saw us put the bikes in the shed, and he took the tools while we were in the house. Unless they were taken after we left the bikes under the trees in the first place. He wouldn't have had time. We only stepped into the front room, and then we all came out after that first shriek. No, the tools were taken when the bikes were in the shed." The boys rode on. The rain had ceased now, but the road was greasy, and they had to call on all their skill to keep from skidding as they drove down the steep road toward the bay. So they did not talk again until they reached the more level highway at the shore. A sound out in the bay attracted Frank's attention, and he looked out over the rolling sweep of waters. He could see a powerful motorboat plunging through the waves about a quarter of a mile out. It was just coming into view around the base of the cliff, and as Frank looked, he saw the nose of still another boat emerging into sight. Each craft was traveling at a high speed. "Looks like a race," remarked Joe. The Hardy Boys stopped their motorcycles and watched the two boats. But it was soon apparent that this was no friendly speed contest. The boat in the lead was zigzagging in a peculiar manner, and the pursuing craft was rapidly overhauling it. The staccato roar of the powerful boats was borne to the lad's ears by the wind. "See, the other boat is chasing it!" Frank exclaimed. He had caught sight of the figures of 2 men standing in the bow of the pursuing craft. They were waving their arms frantically. The first boat turned as though it were about to head inshore at the cliff, and then, apparently, the helmsman changed his mind, for at once the nose of the boat pointed out into the open bay again. But the moment of hesitation had given the pursuers the chance they wanted, and swiftly the gap between the racing craft grew smaller and smaller. The Hardy Boys saw that there was but one man in the foremost craft. He was bent over the wheel. In the other boat, they caught sight of one figure who had snatched up an object that appeared to be a rifle. To their amazement, they saw him aim at the man in the leading craft. Then, across the water, they heard the sharp report. The lone figure in the first boat dropped out of sight. Whether he had been hit or not, the boys could not tell. But the craft did not slacken speed. Instead, it still continued to race madly through the waves. But the pursuers rapidly drew closer, until, at last, the boats were running side by side. They were so close together that it appeared as if a collision were imminent. "The whole crowd of 'em will be killed if they aren't careful," muttered Frank. Just then, when it seemed that both boats must crash together, the pursuing craft, as though it had given up the chase, veered abruptly away and headed out toward the middle of the bay. The speed of the other boat decreased. The roar of its exhaust became intermittent. "Engine trouble?" suggested Joe. But there was more than engine trouble. With startling violence, a sheet of flame leaped high into the air from the motorboat. There was a stunned explosion and a dense puff of smoke. Bits of wreckage were thrown high into the air, and in the midst of it all, the Hardy Boys, horrified, saw the figure of the man they had noticed before as he was hurled into the water. The whole boat was swiftly ablaze. Hardly had the wreckage begun to fall back into the water, with spasmodic patterings and splashes, than the craft was in flames from bow to stern. "Look!" shouted Frank. "He's still alive!" The man of the boat had been killed by neither the rifle shot nor the explosion. They could see him struggling in the water not far from the blazing craft. His head was a dark oval above the water, and he was slowly trying to swim ashore. "He'll never make it," gasped Joe. "We'll have to try to save him," answered his brother. Chapter 5. The Rescue. The Hardy Boys knew they had no time to lose. It was evident from the struggles of the man in the water that he was not an expert swimmer. So far he had not seen the boys, but they could hear him shouting for help, possibly thinking, however, that it was in vain, for it was a lonely part of the bay, and the nearest farmhouse, outside of the deserted Palooka place, was more than half a mile down the road. "Quick!" shouted Frank. "I see a rowboat up on the shore." His sharp eyes had discerned a small boat, almost hidden in a little cove some distance away at the bottom of a steep declivity that was the beginning of the cliff. It could not be reached by going along the shore, and the boys saw that they would have to go along the high ground and then descend to it, for a huge rock that jutted out of the deep water cut the cove off from the more open part of the beach. They left their motorcycles on the side of the road and hurried back up the slope, then cut down across a narrow strip of weeds and grass until they came to the top of the declivity. They could see the victim of the explosion struggling in the waves. The man had seized a piece of wreckage and was able to remain afloat, but the boys knew it was only a matter of time before his strength would give out. "Looks to be almost all in," remarked Frank. "I wonder if he's anybody we know," came from his brother. "It isn't likely." Frank reached out suddenly and caught hold of Joe's arm. "Look out there, you might break a leg." "It certainly is mighty slippery," answered Joe, as he managed to regain his footing. He had come close to going heels over head on the rocks. Slipping and scrambling, they made their way down the slope toward the little cove. Rocks went rolling and tumbling ahead of them. The distance was only a few yards, but the slope was steep, and a false step might result in broken bones. But they reached the bottom in safety, and there they came upon the rowboat. It was battered and old, but evidently still seaworthy. "Into the water with her," said Frank. They seized the boat, and the keel grated on the shingle as the little craft was launched. Swiftly they fixed the oars in the locks, and then they scrambled into their places. They began to row with strong, steady strokes out toward the man in the bay. He had seen them, and was now shouting to them to hurry. "He'd be better off if he'd kept quiet," Joe said. "He's only wasting his strength." Evidently this thought occurred to the victim of the wreck, or else he was becoming weaker, for his cries died away, and the boys did not hear him again. Frank thought he must have gone beneath the waves, and he cast a quick look around. But the fellow was still in view, clinging desperately to his bit of wreckage. The motorboat in the background was still blazing fiercely. Flames were shooting high in the air, and the craft was plainly doomed. A great pillar of smoke was rolling into the sky from the burning boat. As for the other motorboat, Frank could hear the roar of its exhaust as it continued its flight out into the bay. For a while he could see its dim shape when he turned around once in a while, but then the fleeing boat disappeared into the mist and the gloom. The boys exerted all their strength, and the little rowboat fairly leaped over the waves. Both were good oarsmen, and it was not long before they had drawn close to the man in the water. But it looked as though they would be too late. When they were only a few yards away, Frank looked around to shout encouragement to the victim of the wreck. But even as he looked, he saw the man wearily give up his grasp on the piece of wreckage to which he had been clinging. Frank had a glimpse of the white face and the despairing eyes, and then the man sank slowly beneath the waves. "He's drowning, Joe!" shouted Frank, as he bent to his oar again. With a mighty effort they brought the boat close by the place where the man had gone down. Frank leapt to the side of the boat and peered down into the depths. He began taking off his coat, preparatory to diving to the rescue. Then the fellow came to the surface again, gasping for breath, but so weak that he could scarcely make a struggle. He emerged from the water, right beside the boat, and Frank leaned over, grasping him by the hair. This sufficed to prevent the man from sinking for the second time, and Frank managed to get a grip on the collar of his coat. Then, with Joe helping, and in imminent danger of upsetting the boat, he managed to drag the stranger to the side of the craft. The fellow was a dead weight, for he had lapsed into unconsciousness when Frank seized him, but somehow they contrived to get him into the boat, and there he lay, sprawled helplessly, more dead than alive. "We'd better get him to shelter someplace and revive him," said Joe. "We can't do much for him here." "How about that farmhouse down the bay?" "The very place. Where is it?" They finally located the farmhouse, a snug little building back off the main road, some distance down the bay. It meant considerable rowing, but there was a life at stake. The blazing motorboat nearby was a roaring mass of flames. Then it began to sink beneath the waves. There was a great hissing sound and a heavy cloud of steam. As the craft sank lower and lower into the water, its blazing embers blackening to the touch of the sea. Swiftly at last, the boat disappeared. Its stern seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then it slid quickly down into the waves, and the only trace was a widening pool of oil and scattered wreckage on the surface of the water. But the Hardy boys were too busy to give more than passing notice to the spectacle. Their immediate problem was to get the stranger under shelter. Frank decided there was no necessity for first aid. The man had been conscious when he rose from the water the first time, so there could not be much water in his lungs. He had simply given in to exhaustion and fatigue resulting from his long struggle in the waves. They headed the boat down the bay, in a direct line with the little farmhouse, which they could see nestling among the trees. They had already spent much energy in rowing out to the rescue of the stranger, but they fell to the new task with a will. Rowing with machine-like precision, they felt the little boat respond to every effort, and it fairly leaped along. This time, they had the wind and the waves with them, and they made good time. The man they had rescued lay face downward in the bottom of the boat. He was a slim, black-haired fellow. His clothes, which of course were soaked with water, were cheap and worn, the sleeves being frayed at the cuffs. They could not see his face, but they judged him to be young. He was still unconscious. Frank let Joe take his oar for a moment and crouched down beside the stranger. He turned the man over, and the limp form lolled about, as helplessly as a bag of salt. As they had surmised, he was a young fellow, with sharp, clean-cut features. He wore a cheap shirt, open at the throat. Frank pressed his ear to the fellow's chest and listened for signs of life. Finally, he straightened up with a mutter of satisfaction. "His heart's beating all right," he told Joe. "He's alive at any rate. Just all in. He'll come to after a while." He returned to his oar, and the little boat skimmed over the waves on toward the farmhouse in the distance. The boys rowed until the muscles of their arms were aching, but at last they drew near the shore, and finally the pebbles grated underneath the keel. Frank leaped out and dragged the boat part way up on the beach. Then between them, they carried the unconscious man up the rocky shore toward the farmhouse. They found a path that led through a field up to the back door of the house, and although their burden was heavy, they managed to carry the still figure, limp and motionless, across the field. A gaunt, kindly-faced woman came hurrying out of the house at their approach, and from the orchard nearby came a man in overalls. The farmer and his wife had seen them. "Laws, what's happened now?" asked the woman, wide-eyed as they came up to her. "This man was mighty nearly drowned out in the bay," explained Frank. "We saw your house." "Bring him in," boomed the farmer. "Bring him indoors." The woman ran ahead of them and held the door open. With the farmer giving aid, the boys carried the unconscious man into the house and placed him on a couch in the comfortably furnished living room. The farmer's wife glanced dubiously at the stream of water that dripped from the victim's clothes, for she was a tidy soul, and she had just scrubbed the floor that morning. But her better nature overcame her housewifely instincts, and she hastened out to the kitchen to prepare a hot drink. "Best rub his hands," suggested the farmer. He was a burly man with a black beard. "It'll bring the blood back to his cheeks. One of you take off his boots, and we'll wrap his feet up in warm flannels." For the next 5 minutes, the house was a scene of excitement as the farmer and his wife bustled about, and the Hardy boys rubbed industriously at the hands and feet of the unconscious man, trying to restore him to consciousness. At last there was a sign of reviving life. The man on the couch stirred feebly. His eyes fluttered. His lips moved, but no words came. Then the eyes opened, and the man stared at them, as though in a daze. "Where am I?" he muttered faintly. "You're safe," Frank assured him. "You're with friends." "Pretty near cashed in, didn't I?" "Yes, you pretty nearly drowned, but you're all right now." "It was Snackly," said the stranger, as though talking to himself. "Snackly got me. The rat." This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the Hardy Boys in The House on the Cliff. Please let me know of other books that you'd like to hear on this podcast. It's wonderful to hear from you. I'll talk to you again soon.